Okay, looks like majority of our attendees have joined, so we will go ahead and get started. Again, this is the Webair and Veeam webinar titled Everything You've Ever Wanted to Know About Disaster Recovery. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sagi Brody. I'm the Chief Technical Officer for Webair, and I'm also part of the Veeam Vanguard program. And today I'm joined by Anthony Spiteri, a Senior Global Technologist for Veeam. Anthony, thank you for joining us.
No problem, Sagi.
If those of you out there have not heard of Anthony, which I highly doubt, if you are interested in backups and DR, he is a technologist for Veeam. He is probably one of the smartest guys I know, and I would highly encourage you to check out his blog at anthonyspiteri.net. Not only does he talk about backups and DR, but there's this really great general tech information about new technologies. There's a lot there about containers, Kubernetes, infrastructure as code, and other great topics. I personally think it's a great blog. Also check out his new podcast, Great Things with Great Techs, which is at gtwgt.com. And I thought that's a great podcast, especially since he had me on there a few weeks ago. Thank you for that, Anthony.
No worries, mate.
So just a little bit of housekeeping, just a little bit about Webair and Veeam first, if you don't know. And by the way, as was mentioned in the email announcement on the registration link, if you're joining us today, you're eligible for 5 terabytes of free backups and DR storage with Webair. If you like, you can email us at webinars@webair.com about that. And anyone who registered is eligible to win one of $300 food deliveries that we're offering. So thank you for joining us today. So yeah, just a little bit about Webair and Veeam. If you don't know Webair, we're a managed cloud infrastructure provider. We're headquartered in New York, and our primary business is on providing hybrid cloud and managed infrastructure solutions, typically to enterprise organizations or mid-market organizations. And the reason I focus on those types of organizations is because they typically have a variety of different requirements around platforms and infrastructure. Sometimes they have compliance requirements. When an organization reaches a certain size, cookie cutter solutions are sometimes they're not cookie cutter. These organizations have very specific compliance requirements or networking needs, and those are the ones that we focus on. And disaster recovery networking is a great example of something that is not simple and straightforward. So that's a big focus of Webair. We've also been provided industry accolades. We've been in Gartner's disaster recovery Magic Quadrant report for the last few years. We've been provided accolades by IDC as well. And if you haven't heard about Veeam, Anthony, you want to give us your take on Veeam?
Yeah, no worries. Thanks again, and hey everybody. So just a quick overview about Veeam. So Veeam, now in 2019, moving into 2020, we passed that magical $1 billion mark for a software company. So for a pure software company, that's a really great achievement. Puts us in that official unicorn status. So very proud of that, and looking, towards what we're calling Act 2, which takes us into doubling that 2 billion and beyond. So just in regards to that as well, we got acquired at the beginning of the year by a company called Insight. They do a bunch of private equity, and they wholly acquired us. So now Veeam traditionally was headquartered out of Switzerland, founded by our founders who were Russian, but now we're actually fully American. So that was done at the beginning of the year, and we're very proud to be headquartered in the US at this point. In terms of the other numbers, I don't want to sit here and sort of talk a lot about them. I think one of the big things though is to look at is the 375,000 accumulated customers over our period. It's a huge number. Just shows that a lot of people have faith in the software, and it's why a lot of our providers actually love working with us as well, because of that install base. We're purely channel driven, which is very important with regards to working with our Veeam cloud and service providers. And generally speaking, I mean, the Net Promoter Score is something that I personally don't like talking about too much, but suffice to say, I think this one that we have, we're proud of it because it's up around 75, and that's based not only on support, but also product, and that's an important differentiator there. Do you want to go to the next slide, Sigi?
Yep.
And just quickly talking about the Veeam differentiators. So Veeam has been successful because right from the start, we had these three foundational thoughts, around simplicity, flexibility, and reliability. Veeam is a very simple product to install. You can kind of get it from zero to backing up your infrastructure within 7 clicks if you wanted to. But there's also simplicity in the way that it actually is deployable as well. And that then lends to the flexibility. So hardware agnostic, software driven. We love giving our customers and our providers the freedom of choice to basically choose their own infrastructure, their own hardware to actually store their backups on. So, we're not going to lock you into an appliance. It's totally flexible from that point of view. But I think at its core, and what's really important when talking about disaster recovery scenarios and solutions and technology is that reliability. Veeam is extremely reliable. There's some crazy number with our support where from a major release, 3 months after that major release, we have 80% of our customer base actually upgraded. And that's kind of unheard of, but it's because we release really, really reliable software. Do you want to go to the next slide? And that's kind of been, backed by the fact that Gartner have us almost, if the Magic Quadrant for this year came out, we were the most top left in the actual quadrant, and obviously in terms of executing as well. So very proud to be up there. Forrester, all the usual sort of guys have marked us as being, leader, and we continue to take growth in the market as well. So in fact, there's a stat that came out recently where Gartner placed us 3rd overall in the actual addressable market for software backups. So we're very proud of that fact as well. And now just to get onto the good stuff, here to talk about networking and DR. I've, like Sagi said, I appreciate Sagi telling me about, giving me those great words. But if I can tell you one thing, is that Sagi is more smarter than I am and a lot better to be talking to you guys about DR networking, because from what I've seen in the conversations I've had with him over the past couple of years, he is definitely the man to be giving this this webinar. So the reality though is that disasters happen. We know all around the world that we're up for those ones that are natural. So fire, flood, storm. We're seeing fires. We had fires in Australia at the moment. We had fires in Australia at the beginning of the year. America is going through the fires in Oregon and California at the moment. So fires are very real in terms of a threat. Floods. I believe there's a cyclone coming on the other side. Sagi as well from memory at the moment. So so you're getting hit by both ends, by the floods and the storms, and that's just the natural side. And then the more scary component of it for those that aren't sort of in those sort of areas is the fact that malware, malicious intent, that's really picked up. Ransomware is big. That they're becoming more sophisticated. So really, you need an end-to-end disaster recovery plan. And then obviously hardware failure can still happen, and data corruption. And that's where you really need to think about an end-to-end solution. And I've been talking a lot recently about ransomware and DR. And I think the biggest thing that I've been talking about is the fact that hardware and technology is only part of it. You need more. It's an end-to-end approach, right? So it's like an insurance plan traditionally, but the thing about insurance is you don't typically test it. You don't typically test how it's going to actually do its thing. It's kind of just sitting there waiting to go. So this is where a company like Webair comes into play to help you actually make sure that when you actually have that insurance plan laid out, it's going to work for you. So yeah, it's an overall solution. But Sagi, what do you think about this? Because obviously there's a lot on the screen there in terms of the wordage. But what's your take about it as a checklist? Because obviously you're talking to customers more than I am today. What are they really looking for, and what advice are you giving them from the point of view of a checklist?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of misinformation out there, with the end user. People have misconceptions about what disaster recovery really is and what it means. And I think an easier way for me to say it is tell you what it's not. A disaster recovery capability is really not the ability to sort of restore an offsite backup in a pinch, on some new environment that you may or may not use, and sort of try to do the networking on the fly, right? In fact, disaster recovery, I believe, has nothing to do with backups. And that's the first thing that people need to sort of differentiate. Backups, be it onsite or offsite, have different goals. and different requirements and different strategies from disaster recovery. Disaster recovery really needs to be pre-planned, pre-orchestrated, with the ability to instantly boot up on a similar or better platform at the DR site with all of the networking, which we'll get into in a minute, sort of ready to go and pre-planned so that the users can consume the applications exactly the same way they were doing in production with no other changes. And I think over the years, people have, set the bar pretty low. If they achieved offsite backups, okay, great, that's good enough. I can check a button on my compliance report, or push come to shove, I can probably figure it out on the fly. That was okay years ago. In fact, when we would set up DR for customers over the years, it used to be that once replication was up and running and their data was replicated, they'd disappear on us. They'd be like, okay, wow, okay, we just hit a milestone, and then they go and deal with a gazillion other IT problems, and we'd be sitting there like, all right, guys, we still haven't set up your networking plan or anything else, done any orchestration, but that was good enough. But now, I think from a compliance perspective, auditors and different sort of regulatory frameworks are demanding a real DR strategy, and people now need a legitimate DR strategy because of things like ransomware. This is, I think, the way to really think about DR. If you got hit tomorrow with ransomware, what is less painful for you? Is it paying the ransom, or is it hitting the button on your DR strategy? And this all comes down to confidence. Do you have a DR strategy? Has it been tested? Do you really have the confidence to pull the trigger on the DR strategy, or is paying $20,000 maybe just going to be easier for you to get out of the pickle?
Yeah, and I guess that depends on how many Bitcoin you have lying around, isn't it? If you have a couple of Bitcoin, then probably you're prepared to do it. But the reality is, it's more than just that ransom, right? I mean, the ransom is significant, but it's more than that. If your business is down, there's brand and reputation at stake. So that's where the DR strategy has to take into consideration. It's more than just getting your systems up and running, right? Getting it back up. I use the example, Sagi, about Garmin. They had a fairly, popular, it was widely reported ransomware attack about a month ago now, and they basically had to shut down their whole operation, right? So this is a big brand, worldwide brand, like, multi-million dollar company, hundreds of million, and they've basically shut up shop for a week and a half while they work out if they can recover. And in that time, the brand took a significant hit. There were talks of class action, people that bought watches that couldn't use them. So this is what it really means in terms of, being hit by something that triggers a DR event. And again, it's not just ransomware as such. Okay, you do have to pay like in the end of the day, Garmin paid the ransom because their brand was getting impacted too much. So you guys have got to trust suppliers like Webair to help you create a DR strategy that puts you not in that position.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I even had a call this weekend from someone who got hit with ransomware, and he's like, oh, I heard you guys do ransomware recovery, disaster recovery, and I'm like, yeah, but you kind of have to call us before you get hit. So that's how it is, But so I think hopefully we've done a good enough job talking about sort of the potential issues that are out there, and I think that everyone sort of understands the threats and hopefully realizes what a good DR strategy requires. And I think for me, it really is all about the network. And really, now we'll kind of get into the actual networking components here, but people are sort of overly focused on replication and copying their data offsite when it comes to disaster recovery. And it's really, tools like Veeam have made that part easy. You can replicate your VMs, your unstructured data very quickly with a tool like Veeam. That's not the hard part anymore. The hard part is, how do you actually make that application consumable? And that's a networking challenge. And I think the first thing that people need to consider when they think about disaster recovery and networking is, what type of events am I trying to protect against? Do you want a capability so that if your entire production environment goes down, maybe your building loses power, or a backhoe cuts the fiber, you can fail over, or a hardware issue at the production site, or your SAN dies and you need to fail everything over. Yeah, I mean that's the full site failover capability, and that's probably the easiest to achieve. Are you also looking for a partial capability where you will move over a single application to the DR site, or do you want a capability that allows you to move over a single server or VM? Now, of course, everybody says yes, all of the above. right? Everybody wants to protect against everything, and ultimately that would be the ultimate goal. The problem is that each one of those becomes increasingly difficult. And if you try to build a DR capability specifically around the networking that can protect against all of those right off the bat, you might, depending on how mature your network is or how clean and segmented it is, you may or may not be able to achieve that. So typically what we like to say is, start with the full site failover capability. It's the easiest to achieve. You can really use like a one-to-one mapping between your production and DR. All of the, we're assuming all the resources that are down in production, so it's very easy for us to bring them all up at the DR site. All the IPs can stay the same. I'll talk a little bit about the network integration in a few minutes, but that's usually the easiest. The partial site failover, depending on how clean and segmented and nice your network was set up, can be simple. Like, in this table, what you're seeing is an application. So when we talk about failing over applications, we're really talking about failing over a group of VMs that come up from the same point in time together. Veeam refers to those as failover plans. And so if you have a specific network subnet, in this example, a /25 for each one of your applications, it's very easy to fail over the associated network resources of the application when you fail over the application. Now, if, like some companies, you have a flat, big layer 2 network, one big subnet with all different VMs, it's not going to be as straightforward for you to fail over your application. And so one of the things that people need to think about is when you're standing up new infrastructure, the network segmentation on a per application basis will really help you with disaster recovery later. So the partial site failover becomes less challenging if you already have that network segmentation per app. If you don't, it's more challenging. And then finally, the single server failover, that's like the golden ticket, right? To be able, if one VM gets hit with ransomware, to be able to fail over that one VM at the DR site, have it still speak to all of the infrastructure back at production, that's that's the best type of scenario. But it's very challenging because if you do have a single VM that's sitting in a subnet and you want to fail it over, all the other servers in that subnet are going to want to speak to that server on the same local LAN. They're not going to route for that traffic. They're going to send out an ARP request and look for that server on the local LAN. And so that requires a unique set of challenges, which we'll get into. So, again, before you go and build DR, think about the types of events that you want to protect against and really understand, what's achievable, what do you want your phase 1 capability for, and so on. Some of our customers actually, one of the requirements is to be able to use DR so they can do maintenance, of their production site, and that really requires a very mature networking model, which is achievable. So when Webair, as we were onboarding customers for disaster recovery as a service, this is one of the first questions we ask: what are you trying to achieve? And then we start peeling back the onion and seeing how difficult it may or may not be depending on what their network looks like. The last scenario to consider too, or the last type of event as it relates to DR networking, is how are you going to test it? Testing is really a standalone scenario to be considered and planned for in advance. The other thing too is we really advocate to, when you fail over to the DR site, we want to keep things as they were at production. We don't want to change IP addresses of servers when we fail you over. That's the last thing you want to be doing, even if it can be automated. Changing IP addresses is never something that you want to do. And so if we keep the IP as the same at DR, and if you want to test the applications at the DR site, how do you do that if the IPs are the same? And I think mostly what people will do is just have a sort of VPN client that goes to the DR site, and if you do that, maybe a site to client VPN from a laptop, now you're directly into the DR environment. It's fenced off from production, and you can test your applications on the legitimate internal IP addresses. You can use the original host names if they're, let's say, internal web-based applications. Some of our customers will have a dedicated site-to-site VPN for testing, and some of them even have like a room in their office for people that are still going to offices where if you just walk into that room and you just start using a PC, you're hitting the DR site, and so they'll actually have the application owners go into this room and do DR testing in there, and so that kind of makes it foolproof. But I think For more mature organizations and enterprise organizations, they're looking for something better. And so what the other thing we see is really setting up a dedicated test network, let's say like a /24. Like in this example, what we see is that on the right, on the DR side, it's sitting on all the VMs are sitting on the production IPs. And then we have a firewall, which is NATing the production IPs at the DR side to a dedicated test network. And then the users can have host files for alternative entries for the DR sites, just point to the test IPs, or they can just update their host file as needed to perform DR testing. So in this scenario, we can have a corporate environment where there's a dedicated test network always on and a very simple procedure for users to test from the DR site. So really, again, you got to think about the testing scenario right off the bat too, because you might think you have a really great failover procedure, but it might be difficult to test. The other thing that I think a lot of people don't consider is that DR testing can actually be very dangerous. And the reason why is because today, we're living in a very hybrid IT, hybrid cloud world. And so it's more likely these days that your applications are speaking to third-party services. Maybe your applications are speaking to Salesforce. Maybe they're talking to QuickBooks Online. Maybe you have a feed into your EMR system or financial services partner, and your applications are communicating with those third-party systems. They're reading data from them, and they could be writing data to them too. And so if you bring up your applications in the DR site, as you normally would, and your users start testing the applications at the DR site, they might inadvertently be modifying production data at one of your third-party applications or third-party sites. And that's super dangerous. I mean, just booting up VMs at DR, if they have unfettered internet access, who knows what they're doing with your partners or your third-party applications. So we have to be really careful here, and the best thing to do is really kind of block it if possible. Though if we block that traffic, can you actually test your applications? Maybe your applications need access to those third-party systems in order to function properly, in order for you to do your application DR testing. So sometimes your vendors might give you maybe sandbox credentials. Maybe they're giving you a different host name or endpoint for their service that goes to a sandbox that's different from their production. Maybe they're giving you different set of credentials. And so, how are you going to be able to test that? Do you want to modify your application so that you change a bit so that if you're running in DR, it's going to hit the sandbox? I mean, who wants to modify the application? Who wants to have to remember to do that for a legitimate disaster recovery or for testing? And so one of the scenarios that I've been looking at, and we've worked with some customers, is putting a proxy in place, having a proxy server at the DR site that's going to intercept the request to all the third parties. And right away, you absolutely know you're not going to have any sort of data loss at the third party sites. You can intercept the request. You can even mimic the responses from the third party on the proxy itself yourself. You can just respond yourself with your own test site if you wanted to, or the proxy can do the work of hitting the third party service using the alternative sandbox hostname or the alternative credentials. And that way you're super safe and you can control it. You don't have to rely upon the application developers to add in these different bits. You don't have to rely upon humans to remember to do that. And you're absolutely going to block all the traffic. You're going to proxy it the way that you want to. And then during a legitimate DR, you can just remove that static route to the proxy site so it flows to production. So again, I don't think people are really thinking about this and really understand the dangers of what DR testing can do. So again, something to think about and to plan for and to build for. Anthony, is that something that you've ever seen or heard of on your side? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think you've hit the mark though. Like networking isn't simple, and like you said, the easiest part is actually replicating or backing up the VM or the workload these days application. And certainly you have to think about that full, partial, or just a single server failover, and it's a holistic strategy really. So yeah, I mean the easiest thing is for people to sort of sandbox a full failover. That's what we saw when I was working on the other side mostly. But as these but to be fair, in the last 5 years, like you said, the reliance on these third-party external systems actually had a lot of complication. Just yesterday, I've actually been trying to sort of troubleshoot a WordPress site of mine, right? And I took an offline copy of the production, put it into what I thought was a sandbox, but then realized that as soon as I connected to the internet, it started talking to the external services that I used, and it got really confused. That's a real concern when you're doing, live, DR testing. So yeah, it's good to have again, it's good to have the professionals like Sagi and Webair there to do really smart things like put in that DR proxy which solves those problems. So yeah, it's a really important part of the whole DR strategy.
Awesome. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about with DR networking is we mentioned the full site failover capability, how it's the easiest to achieve. And then so kind of taking a deeper look into that is, if you have a corporate WAN environment and maybe you're running MPLS internally or VPLS, and you're running dynamic routing on top of that, let's say it's OSPF internal or IBGP or other dynamic routing. Full site failover is obviously pretty simple to achieve. You're just going to announce the same internal subnets from at the DR site instead of production during an event. And I don't think there's sort of much complication here. If we recommend replicating the VMs, keeping the internal IPs the same. Obviously, we're going to need a default gateway at the DR site that is the same as production. And during a DR event, we're just going to advertise that block. And that advertisement can be done a few different ways, right? We can just enable the dynamic routing at the DR site as needed. We can enable the announcements. You have a firewall which is participating in dynamic routing so that when we enable the inside virtual interface, the production internal subnet, that obviously gets advertised out through the rest of that internal network. This is pretty straightforward, and that's obviously the one that's why we mentioned it as the first one to try to achieve. And again, with this sort of setup, having that dedicated NATed internal subnet always on is very straightforward too. Some of the other full site failover capabilities can be achieved by having users just connect on demand to a VPN for the DR site, maybe having all your users have a secondary VPN configuration that they connect to, or the site-to-site connecting to a secondary, or having the VPN, again, be always on, but enabling that internal LAN interface during a DR event so that the internal subnet gets redistributed back into your internal routing. So again, not much to go over here. So as we start to look at partial failover, and again, we're looking at partial failover on an application basis. If you're running layer 3 dynamic routing within your organization and you have those clean delineation points for your internal subnets per app, again, it's pretty simple. We're going to use dynamic routing. We're going to advertise the specific subnet for each application so that we can fail over an application from production to DR and back very quickly, no IP changes. If your production sites have sort of larger blocks, /24, /23s, obviously we can announce a more specific aggregate from the DR site for each of those smaller applications. The reality though is that, it's funny because when you look at the data movers, the Veeams and all the other data movers that are out there, they all say, hey, yeah, we can support partial site failover, we can support partial site failover, application-based failover all day. But again, there is that asterisk. Your network has to be clean and segmented. And all of the enterprise organizations that I've worked with, I don't think I've ever seen this, that they've already built each application to be in its own subnet, which, from a security perspective, that's highly recommended too. Applications tend to speak to each other within an organization, and you want that traffic flowing through a firewall so you can do some east-west IDS, IPS if you need to, or firewalling. And so if you're already doing this, hats off to you. Partial site application failover is something that you can easily achieve, again, with that dynamic routing, or even from a VPN capability. It also makes failback really easy, right? Now we're just withdrawing the announcements. Everything goes back to the way that it was. And obviously, if you're not aware, Veeam has Veeam and other data movers have very straightforward ways to fail back. We're not shutting down VMs, exporting OVAs, or any of that stuff. The other thing I want to mention is if we're putting a lot of caveats here, and we're saying if you have a clean network, that's great. You can do this partial failover if you're running dynamic routing. But the reality is, a lot of people don't have those things set up. They have legacy older networks, and obviously there's challenges that go around it. So I don't think people realize that, you know, there are some newer sort of software-defined networking tools that not only provide networking capabilities, but also can help for disaster recovery. And obviously there's a lot of hype and buzz around SDN. Anthony, I'm sure that you've seen a lot of this out there, right? Just people going crazy over SDN the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually now, now that we think about it, it's been around in the limelight probably since, VMware bought Nicira, which ended up being their NSX line, and they've kind of moved from NSXV to NSXT. But, like you well know, that kind of opened up a lot of opportunity for service providers to do smarter things with the network at a sort of lower level and automate a lot of things. But not only, providers, but also telcos started to offer more software-defined networking services where you could, basically on a website order a pipe, order a connection as big as you want. I mean, I believe you use a few of those as well. But the hype is real. It's such a significant jump from where we were before software-defined networking was a reality. So yeah, it's absolutely not hyped, and can be certainly leveraged by the tenancy on the production end, and also when they put DR workloads into the cloud.
Yeah. So, and the one that I'm specifically, looking at here is SD-WAN, right? And SD-WAN is obviously very hot these days. But what people might not realize is that if you're using SD-WAN, or if you're using software-defined security tools, zero trust security tools as well, these can really help you with disaster recovery networking, because really what they're doing is they're building policy-based routing for your internal corporate WAN. And you can go right into your SD-WAN controller or your zero trust tool, and you can build a policy that corresponds to each one of your applications. That basically stipulates that IP address of that application is going to be, again, announced from the DR site. And so you can build a policy for each app, leave it disabled, and during a DR event, you just simply enable that policy, and everyone who's connected to that SD-WAN or is using your zero trust security endpoints will now consume that application from the DR site. And so what I've seen is a lot of organizations that have initiatives around disaster recovery and having a better strategy and a legitimate capability, but they're also transitioning from traditional legacy IT networks like MPLS to SD-WAN. And what you have there is these two things hand in hand can really give you a capability that you might not have realized you had. By using SD-WAN, now you can have this automated software-defined DR failover. And as someone who's in IT working on DR, you don't have to go back to your networking team and deal with firewalls and routers. You can have simple policy based for your DR rules. And now, your networking team can go and replace your routers and switches, and it doesn't break your DR strategy at all. And so the way that you implement this is a little bit different per vendor. But we've done some testing with Meraki and VeloCloud and some others, and really, because it's policy based, you can, everything we spoke about minutes ago about the dynamic routing and the announcements, it's all point and click at this point. So the other type of partial site failover capability really comes from sort of doing an L2 stretch. And I don't want to sit here and talk about how horrible L2 stretches are for more than a few minutes, but I think if you're an organization that has a flat network and has all your servers sitting in one subnet in one VLAN, and you want the ability to fail over some specific servers or applications, the go-to method is stretching the L2 network between production and DR. And I think the first question that people ask there is like, well, what good is stretching from production to DR if I'm looking for a DR capability? If the only way to get to the DR site is through production and the production's down, how does that help me? But you'd be surprised how many organizations that we work with that have all of their all of their users sort of flowing through the production site. The VPN endpoints are ending up there. They have a hub and spoke network model to the production site. And they're asking us to build an L2 stretch from there to DR. Yes, if the production network goes down, at that point, yes, you cannot consume DR. But think about all the other more likely scenarios that you can protect against. You can protect against ransomware. You can still protect against application-based failover, single server failovers, and a whole bunch, everything that's not inclusive of the entire site going down. So there's many events that you can protect against.
Yeah, I was just going to say here as well, that this, in my experience and your experience probably as well, this is the more likely outcome, right? That non-whole failure scenario is the likely outcome, in terms of what's going to happen day to day. Someone's going to fat finger something, someone's going to, break an update on a particular server, breaking an application. So, this is where I think while it is a bit dirty, and certainly from a networking perspective, it's the sort of ugly stepbrother. It still has a very real place from a simplicity point of view, at that level.
Yeah, and so the L2 stretch is obviously the first way you can do it. You order a circuit, production DR, you connect them, you stretch your L2, great. And everyone, I think, at this point understands the type of ramifications if you're running spanning tree protocol or similar, where we've actually seen the DR side take down production environments if those precautions are not put in place. It's also dangerous. You spin up the VMs at DR, they're without any sort of precautions, they can steal the IPs of the production site, and so it is extremely dangerous, and it has to really be forethought. Besides the fact that it can cause you all sorts of different spanning tree issues. So I think the next best thing is you can certainly do an IPsec tunnel and run layer 2 on top of your tunnel. If your firewall vendor supports it, most don't. But there are some that do. At Webair, we like to deploy cloud routers, or which are sort of MikroTik Linux-based firewalls. Those support a protocol called Ethernet over IP, which will allow you to stretch layer 2 on top of an IPsec tunnel. That's a little bit better because you're not going to have potential spanning tree problems that take down production, but you'll still have the potential for IP conflicts and all that. The next is double NAT. And double NAT is a scenario where you have a firewall, at production speaking to a firewall DR, maybe over a private link or maybe over a tunnel, and you're just going to translate the production IPs on both sides. And why do you need to do that? It's what I mentioned before. If you have servers at production that are in the same LAN as a server that you want to bring up from the DR site, and those servers need to speak to each other, they're going to send an ARP request. They're going to look for the MAC address of the server at DR, and they're not going to find it. So with double NAT, the firewall at the production site will respond to those requests, send them across to the DR site, which will translate them back to the DR site. This is safe. It's definitely safer than the other two that I mentioned, but the configuration complexity for this option is just horrible. Every time you spin up a server, you got to build those tunnels, and you have to add in all the ports and the NAT rules. It's just I just don't think it's maintainable whatsoever. And actually, we'll talk about in a minute about a way that we can automate that. So now we have VXLAN. So now we have underlay overlay networks to the rescue. The ability to sort of get rid of spanning tree completely and make all the L2 stretch problems go away. And so VXLAN basically allows you to run layer 2 protocols and just send those ARP requests on top of layer 3 routing. And that layer 3 routing can even occur over the public internet. VXLAN is great. A lot of organizations are moving to that now. The only caveat is you have to be running hardware that supports it, or software, at both production and DR. And the last one is VMware's NSX Edge appliance. And so VMware NSX is basically doing underlay overlay VXLAN on the back end itself, and it supports that. But a lot of the customers that we work with are not running NSX at their side. They don't support VXLAN. And so what the NSX Edge appliance does is it allows you to deploy a small VM at the production site, and they're handling all of the translation, underlay, overlay for you so that you can support an L2 stretch over a tunnel or the public internet, and it kind of takes all the legwork out for you. Obviously, this only works on VMware, and you need to be running NSX at your DR site and have to support it. It's also pretty new. The one thing I don't like about this solution is that it requires you to put your production LAN into promiscuous mode, where all of the traffic is just open. So, I don't recommend people using this appliance, or rather enabling that bit until they're hitting a DR. So I would never recommend using the NSX Edge for like a production L2 stretch, but for DR, it's a pretty good option, but it is new. The last option I want to speak about as far as partial site failure with for L2 networks is actually a product by Veeam, which is the NEA. So Anthony, I asked this to you to kind of go over that.
Yeah, so the NEA really came about with the aim to solve the complexity problem of how you do this, and how you can package it up. So we've got a product called Veeam Cloud Connect Replication, and the NEA was brought in to effectively stretch the layer 2 network initially. So if there was a single failover, you could fail over a single workload and effectively stretch your on-premises network to the cloud provider's network, and still have it running as if it was in the same subnet. It worked really well. So that's kind of the premise of it. The other, obviously, the way that we could do this is it was kind of a twofold use. You could actually use this as the gateway itself. So, this can be for the full or partial failover for DR. And in the full failover, effectively it becomes your edge router. And you can configure some, pretty simple, not overly complex, but very simple sort of firewall rules. And that was basically it. So, it's one of those situations where horses for courses, it can do the job. But again, if you needed something a little bit more complex, that's when you'd look at like what Sagi was talking about, the NSX edge or something like that.
Yeah, and I think that the cool thing about the NEA is that, I mentioned before that the double NATing solution technically works really well, but it's such a pain to configure and manage, and the NEA really automates that entire thing for you. You give it pairings of production and DR networking, and when you boot up VMs at DR, it knows the specific IP of those VMs at DR, and it'll build that double NAT rule automatically and just bring that traffic right across. And that's awesome. So for people that are looking for that immediate L2 stretch capability in a simplistic way, it's awesome. And also, it only turns on those appliances when you invoke a DR event. The other cool thing is that it's running through Veeam's existing SSL encrypted tunnel, so you don't even need to go and build separate IPsec tunnels or VPNs for consumption. It'll actually use the same tunnel that it's using to replicate data for that L2 consumption. Okay, I know we're kind of getting short on time, so I'll try to speed it up here. The other type of event that I wanted to talk about is third-party connectivity. So typically, if you have a production environment that has private connectivity to third parties, let's say you're a hospital and you have a private connection to an EMR provider, or let's say you're a financial services firm and you have a private connection to Fiserv or a feed from Bloomberg. Traditionally, people will just order another one of those links for the DR site, and it's like a necessary evil. So now they're paying for duplicate links at the DR site. They're sometimes running another router, and there's just so much operational complexity and overhead that goes along with maintaining those double connections. So we talked about software-defined networking before. There is a way to use software-defined networking to help solve that problem. And the idea is by using network as a service platforms like Megaport or Packet Fabric or Equinix's ECX or some of the others that are out there to basically virtualize interconnection. And what you can do is take that connection from your third party and land it on the network as a service provider's platform. The cross connect will physically go to them. And once it hits their platform, that connection, that actual cross connect, is now a virtual construct that you can mold and change in real time. And so you then have a connection to the network as a service platform at production and to one at DR. And during a DR event, you can log into their portal or via an API, and you can just redirect that connection from the production site to the DR site. And so now you do not need to order double the amount of circuits. You don't have to maintain them. Again, like a lot of people have a secondary circuit to their third party at DR, and eventually they go to failover DR and they realize it hasn't been working for 6 months because you're not always monitoring it and it's difficult to tell. So we can take some of the sort of virtualization capabilities that we can use with compute virtualization, and we can actually apply it to networking. So now we can just fail over and fail back connectivity from production to DR, just like we're doing with our server images. This saves money, it reduces complexity and all that. And so this is a method that we've been advocating our customers to use, and this is part of how we actually help our customers stand up and save money. Now, obviously, this all has to be orchestrated, or everything we went over has to be orchestrated. Anthony, what are you seeing people doing out there for orchestration, not only of networking, but in general for all the different DR components?
Yeah, from the networking point of view, we talked about SDN and how that's enabled. SDNs are built on APIs, right? And they expose as APIs by default. So a lot of providers have built really cool, automation tools and platforms to actually leverage that. When you put it together with what Veeam has with regards to our, PowerShell, the new APIs that we're releasing, this is how a company like Webair can produce a portal like what you're seeing on the screen here. And the beauty about these portals, all powered by APIs at the back end and PowerShell and other bits of infrastructure as code, means that the tenancies and partners and customers can really leverage the portal to do things easier. That's what automation is all about, right? And orchestration. So orchestrate the failover, orchestrate the networking, then go to the DNS and so off and so forth. So yeah, Sagi, this is such a huge play for guys like you to be able to offer services to your customers to make networking, to make that complex part less complex.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned public IP addressing and DNS, and that's not even something that we touched upon, and that's definitely something that could be orchestrated as well. And just touching upon that, I think it's a great topic. In fact, I'm realizing that we had a slide on it that for some reason is not here, but I think we should definitely give it a minute. There's a lot of different scenarios that you can use with that too, with sort of public routing changes, right? Obviously, you can, if you have publicly routable IP addresses, you can fail those over at DR. That only helps you with the full site failover. And a lot of people think, I have my own IPs, I'll just announce them at DR during an event and I'm done. Well, that's great. But again, you can only ever do that when you want to perform a full site failover. It does not help you for per application failover at all. And so you can change DNS, sure. At Webair, we actually run our own authoritative servers and we'll fail over DNS, for our customers. But again, I would look at more sort of software-defined systems and look at stuff like DNS providers that have sort of built-in global load balancing, like folks like Cloudflare or NS1, who can actually, change the DNS really quick, or ones like let's say an Akamai that can actually proxy connectivity from the public sites to your production and DR. And so again, for the people that are looking at just BGP announcements for traditional site failover, for full site failover, there's a better way. And for ones that are just sort of think that they're relegated to making a manual DNS change for public websites and applications, that can be automated too. And you can apply the proxying services or much lower automated DNS and lower TTLs as well. All right, so let's move along. I think the last point we want to make here is there's a lot that we went over, and this all comes down to strategy and integration, and everyone's network is different. There's not really a product out there that you can buy that's just going to solve this problem, or really just a service that you're going to subscribe to. It's not cookie cutter. And so at Webair, we obviously sell disaster recovery as a service. Certainly, people can do all of this themselves. And I'm not really here to advocate for one or the other. It really comes down to, you as an end user or as an organization, what's your appetite to take ownership of all of this, to build all the DR networking, to make sure failback works just as well as failover. And so for ones that have a huge IT organization and who are happy being accountable and responsible for it internally, that's fine. But for others, consuming disaster recovery as a service, you're buying an SLA. You're buying the fact that your applications are going to come up in a pre-orchestrated, pre-planned way every time under an hour, and then you're going to get credits, and sort of monetary consumption or compensation if it doesn't. You're also passing legal liability to the disaster recovery as a service provider, for the DR site. The DR site is also a point of it's a security consideration too. If you have a copy of all your most critical data and applications out there on the public internet, from a security perspective, you have to protect that just as well or better than production. I see a lot of people who have all these great security precautions and proactive security monitoring at production, but then for some reason, none of that's being copied over at DR. So now you have this potential, vulnerability out there on the internet. So when we provide disaster recovery as a service, we're also securing the environment. We've also built the platform so that you can drag along your MSSP, so you can bring your security tools. You can actually use the DR site to enhance production security because you can scan against the DR for vulnerabilities continuously. So you really have to ask yourself, who do you want to be accountable and responsible for disaster recovery? Do you want to own it internally, or do you want to consume it as a service? And here's just a quick list, of who's responsible for what. Obviously, disaster recovery as a service provider like Webair, it's not only the compute infrastructure and the networking and the storage and all the infrastructure, but it's also monitoring of the replication, owning failover, owning failback, taking all the legal liability. I think one of the interesting things to point out with this is, take a look at Veeam. Veeam is building, this amazing orchestration replication tool. But Anthony, I see that you guys sort of have a dual track. You're building the product for the do-it-yourselfers, but you're also building it so that people can consume disaster recovery as a service.
Yeah, it's kind of, for an enterprise, we've got this product called Veeam Availability Orchestrator, and certainly that's an option. However, from my selfish point of view, I think I love supporting our Veeam Cloud service providers who are building the services out of Cloud Connect, and we keep on adding value, to the Cloud Connect product set. We've got the vCloud Director support. We do Cloud Connect backup, Cloud Connect replication. That then allows you guys to wrap around your own services, around that product itself in a multi-tenant sort of way. So, yeah, we've got two tracks. VAO will get mature. But certainly my hope is that, people listening and customers of yours, past and present, would want to stick with you guys, because I think there's lots of flexibility in what we offer as a platform overall. And that's the key, right? Offering, you guys the ability to pick and choose what you want from the technology and innovation that we represent, and then being able to offer that to your customers in the form of these DR services that you see in front of you.
Yeah, and I think, for me as a Webair as a DR service provider, the fact that you have Veeam as a software tool investing so much into the DR as a service, provider and capability just shows, how much of the market is sort of choosing to just consume DRaaS as a service. And what a great way to get yourself into hybrid. If you're already owning your own infrastructure, manage your infrastructure, and you want to kind of dip your toes into the cloud, sort of throwing out your DR site and consuming that as a service, to me, it's just like, it's a no-brainer. Like, what a better best place to start. So we have a few minutes left, and I do want to get to a few questions, but I just do want to cover, like, again, what do you get when you consume DRaaS as a service? And as you can see with the network, disaster recovery, it's not just replicating a few VMs. You need to really duplicate everything at the production site. And if your definition of production is not only VMware or Hyper-V, but also physical servers or IBM iSeries or P-Series, or NAS or direct iSCSI, SAN mounts into your VMs, that all has to come over. And so with Webair, we're really here to be a full service enterprise grade disaster recovery as a service provider and replicate 100% of your production environment. We can't go to our enterprise customers and say, yeah, we'll replicate your VMs, but that one old IBM server, we're just going to ignore that. I mean, it's obviously there because it's important. And so we can really handle the entire infrastructure stack for enterprise, regardless of how old it is or how legacy it is. We can handle connectivity to public clouds, and we bring all the network consulting that everything we went over today. That's part of our process as we do the onboarding to help our customers build the DR strategy. It's really it's a consulting engagement, and we bring with us all of the experience of doing this hundreds of times with other enterprise organizations and say, here's what works, here's what doesn't work, here's what we've seen fail and succeed. And so the nice thing is the DR as a service is just paid for on a per server per month basis. It's how many servers are we replicating and how much storage are they consuming. And with that model, you're going to get fully owned disaster recovery, us taking ownership of failover and failback. We'll actually own both processes. You do have complete self-service capability. You don't need to go through us. You can go into the portal and spin up the environment as needed, but it's a fully managed service. So you can also call us and say, hey, Webair, we're down right now. We need you guys to bring us up immediately. And we'll stay on the phone with our customers and even our customers' third-party application vendors until everything is up and running. So we'll own the onboarding. We'll create the runbooks. We even provide 3 days out of every month to do free testing included. So, if you want more information, you can contact us. This is where we have disaster recovery sites. We work with a lot of organizations that have huge global networks and global sites and need sovereignty within different countries. And we also, use the networking to really solve compliance problems. We use the networking to present our disaster recovery as a service inside our customers' organizations, so that their DRaaS infrastructure just looks like another tenant on their existing network. Disaster recovery and cloud in general should not be an exception to your existing security frameworks and your network frameworks. Cloud shouldn't be an exception. So we're able to sort of use some of the networking tools that I mentioned to present our disaster recovery as a service as if it's just another member of your existing network infrastructure. And I can show you hundreds of diagrams of what that ended up looking like, for a bank like we see here, or for a hospital. And as I mentioned before, the definition of production is really changing. It's not just a single site. Maybe your production environment is 3 data centers, some public cloud, some IBM, private connectivity to Azure. So whatever it is, we've dealt with it before, and we have methods to provide you with a fully managed and accountable disaster recovery as a service. Anthony, I know you guys are seeing the same thing, right, on the hybrid side?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like we say, it's a multi-hybrid cloud world now. So you've not only got to think about applications and workloads that sit traditionally on premises, but maybe in your own data centers, or in third-party providers. Maybe you're hosting servers with Webair, or in fact you've got public cloud workloads running on EC2, or even serverless, and the workloads and data are there. So yeah, certainly it's gone from data management to cloud data management, as we say, and that's part of that multi-hybrid that we're talking about.
Yeah, and like at Webair, again, I'm not here to say, you should use us for disaster recovery as a service, or this cloud is better than that cloud. I think that the overall message is really that different workloads require different platforms. Each workload is going to have its unique requirements around security, latency, cost, and there's going to be a good home for each type of workload. It's not, I don't see as many organizations today saying we're going all in with AWS, we're going all in with Azure, or we're only on-prem. It's all going hybrid, and so organizations need to think hybrid. And the one thing with that is, as you start consuming different cloud providers or even SaaS, how does that translate into your disaster recovery strategy? How are you going to achieve the same RTO and RPO when you are using specific SaaS platforms and cloud platforms? So at Webair, we try to be the disaster recovery as a service provider that can handle all those unique requirements. But I'd really encourage organizations to think about what does it mean for disaster recovery when you go to consume new platforms and services for your production, because you want to be sure it doesn't break your strategy. So I think we have time, one more minute here, we'll take one question. So there was a question that came in from Justin. What about Failback? And I totally agree with you, Justin. Yes, the failover is much easier than Failback. And what I'd like to do is answer it from a networking perspective. After all, this is a networking webinar. But sometimes people will build a private connection from their production and DR site for the replication. And what typically happens is you do your initial seeding. Maybe you have a 1 gig pipe, and you replicate your data day one, and maybe it takes 2 weeks for the DR site to catch up. And during that time, your gig pipe is at 100%. No big deal. You're doing your seeding, and once the initial seeding is done, now your link is at 10%, just replicating your change data. And you're looking at your link and saying, wow, we have all this capacity. This is good, no problem. Then you fail over to DR. You run off of DR for 3 days, and now you need to fail back to production. So what happens is now you're enabling reverse replication, which is something that Veeam orchestrates and manages very well, the reverse failback. It's not a shut down my VMs, export them, copy over, and boot them up. It's fully orchestrated and automated. But from a networking perspective, now your 1 gig link is at capacity again. And you had a false sense of security. You thought you had this link that's at 10% between the sites, and now it's at capacity because you have 3 days worth of change data to bring back. And maybe the CEO needs it failed back now, because of slowness or whatever the reason, and you're stuck with that 1 gig pipe. Try calling Verizon or whatever provider and saying, hey, can you boost that up to 10 gigs temporarily for me? It won't happen. And so I go back to the network as a service providers, the Packet Fabrics, the ECXs of the world, because if your replication traffic is flowing over that platform, you can actually log in and hit a button and increase that link from 1 gigs to 10 gigs for a few days. You can actually fail back much quicker and not have that false sense of security with that link. So that's what I'll say on that. Again, like I said before, there's a lot of software-defined networking that can help for all different aspects of DR. So that's all I had. Anthony, final word from you on this?
Yeah, look, I think you can do worse than to put your DR strategy in the hands of Webair, right? I think they've shown their professionalism and their knowledge of the end-to-end networking and the challenges that are involved with DR. And again, it's not just about the failover and the replication of that machine. It's all about the networking. It's always been the hardest part, and certainly from my experience, Webair are one of the best at actually simplifying that and taking the complexity out of it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anthony. Thank you, everyone, for joining. If you have additional questions or want to chat about any of these topics, email webinars@webair.com. We live and breathe this stuff, especially with the DR networking, so we'd love to chat with you about it. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.